The man awoke about 4 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock. He reached over to find his wife Annie was not in bed. Then as he got up to wash his face, he started to notice the smell of bacon in the air. He smiled and walked downstairs to the dining room where his wife Annie was standing waiting for him to sit. At 66 and a full United States Air Force General, Mike was the father of 4 children, all grown. 3 daughters and a son. One daughter adopted since she was 3 years old. All 4 of his kids were married, and he and Annie has 7 grandchildren. Mike and Annie ate as they discussed their upcoming trip to be with their son Richard and his wife Sherry, as Sherry was due to have the couple's first child within the next few days. The man finished his meal and left the home to run several miles before he had to be in his office at 7 a.m. After his run and a shower and shave, Mike put his uniform on and got in his car and drove to his office. Once there, he was met by his aide, Major Linda Cobb. "Good morning, General," Linda said. "Good morning, Major," Mike returned the greeting. Both walked almost 40 feet from the door that separated the rest of the headquarters building from the command section to his office. As the general sat down, he picked up his phone and called his chief of staff to come to his office. Then sent Major Cobb to go make contact with his command chief, Chief Master Sergeant Lydia Wilson. The general had a problem that morning and had come to a decision on how best to handle it. One of the wing commanders who served in his command had been caught with another man's wife. Mike was sadly going to be forced to end that colonel's career. The general's chief of staff was Brigadier General David Foster, and he was the one that informed the general of the problem at that base. About an hour later, sitting around a table, the people assembled spoke about the problems on a list of things to discuss. The general finished by telling them in 4 days he would be leaving to accompany his wife to go visit his son. As the general walked from the room, he motioned for his number 2 Lieutenant General Robert Wilkins to walk with him. As the 2 men walked, Mike spoke to Robert and said, "Bob, I was not present when any of my children were born. With Kristen 35 years ago, I was over the Atlantic returning from a 2-month deployment with my squadron. With Dawn 32 years ago, I was stuck at Logan Airport in Boston because of bad weather. With Richard 28 years ago, I was flying on the West Coast and did not get back to the base in time. Annie went through those births alone. Bob, I was not present when any of my grandkids were born either. It was always something. Bob, I am going on leave, and nothing short of World War III is keeping from this grandbaby's birth." Robert looked at Mike and said, "Mike, sir, it is the nature of the beast. When you were accepted at the Air Force Academy, you knew what this life required." Mike stood in silence for a moment, then looked at Robert. "Bob, I put in my retirement papers a month ago. My replacement has been selected, and his name will be sent to the Senate for confirmation for promotion to general and to replace me. During the call, I spoke with the chief of staff about you. Bob, this is your last posting. You will not put on a 4th star." Bob said, "General, I suspected this when I was not selected at Global Strike Command. Carol and I are looking forward to getting back to Arkansas and our kids. Where will you and Annie retire to, General?" Mike said, "Bob, we are going back to South Carolina." As Mike said that, Major Cobb stood about 15 feet away, attempting to stay out of the men's conversation. As the men separated and walked away, Major Cobb walked up to the general and said, "General, your wife wants you to call her when you get back to your desk." Mike walked back to his office, closed the door, and picked up the phone and dialed the number. About 10 minutes before this conversation on his base, Mike's son Richard was walking to his aircraft and took notice of the airmen working around it. Richard, a United States Air Force captain, was going to joining several other pilots testing some new device the Air Force was wanting to use. He thought about Sherry as he approached the aircraft and got into his seat. Another airman was helping him get settled. Richard was going over the checklist when one of the master sergeants walked over to him, and using a throat-cutting move using his finger, Richard knew he was not flying, at least not right now. Richard got out of the aircraft, and the other man told him, "Sir, please report to operations." Richard done as asked and walked across the ground and entered the building. About 20 minutes before this all happened, Sherry had called a neighbor because her water broke. The neighbor got her in the car, and they headed toward the hospital. On the way, Sherry used her phone and dialed a number stored in her contacts. This number was to her doctor. "Water broke, on way to hospital," Sherry said into the phone. Then she dialed another number in her contacts and called Richard's squadron and spoke to a female. "Hello, I am Sherry Rankin, and my husband, Captain Richard Rankin, needs to be notified my water broke." Then a cramp hit her, and she screamed. Richard was notified of the situation and headed out to the hospital. On the way, he called his mom to tell her, "Mom, I only have a few minutes, but Sherry is in labor, water broke, and I am on the way to the hospital. Please tell Pop." Annie called her husband's office and asked to speak to him. A moment later, Mike was on the phone. "Mike, Sherry's water broke. I am finishing up packing. Do you want any uniforms in your garment bag, and if so, how many?" Mike answered, "Damn, Annie, 3 days early." Annie laughed. "Mike, babies don't come on a schedule. Get your butt home and let's get out of here now." Mike answered, "A Class A and 2 shirts. You know the drill, dear." Mike then called his aide, Major Linda Cobb, and said, "Major, call over to Martin Aviation and have my twin Cessna pulled out of the hangar and fueled. Then file the IFR flight plan already finished in my laptop for takeoff in 30 minutes. The baby is coming." "Yes, sir," Linda said, and made the call. By the time Richard got into the maternity department of the hospital, the neighbor who took Sherry to the hospital was waiting. She walked up to Richard and said, "Richard, Sherry is with the doctor now. You need to go see that lady behind the desk and she will help you get back to see Sherry." "Richard, I need to get back home." Richard nodded his head and said, "Thank you for getting Sherry here. I will call you later." Then he walked over to the desk and let the lady know who he was. An hour later, Mike and Annie were in their twin Cessna at 25,000 feet and about 3 hours from their destination. Richard was sitting alone in the maternity waiting area and Sherry was in labor room 4 in pain. Richard had already called Sherry's parents and they were already about to park in the hospital parking area. Sherry, although in some pain, was also worried. She could not be sure the baby boy she was carrying belonged to Richard. Sherry had already berated herself for being so dang stupid. The man she had that fling with was from Mexico, and there was no way she could hide it from Richard if he turned out to be the father. Back in the twin Cessna, Mike was listening to Kansas City Center, Twin Cessna November Romeo Papa 300, contact Memphis Center 132-375. Good day. Mike acknowledged the instruction and changed frequency. Memphis Center Romeo Papa 300 is with you at flight level 25. The center controller then replied, "Romeo Papa 300, radar identified." Mike looked at Annie and could see she was sleeping. As he sat, he thought about the day Richard was born. He did not make it back to the base by the time she delivered. She was so beautiful as she slept in that bed with Richard close by. He was so tiny. Mike had met Annie while stationed in the UK and flying the F-111 Aardvark. Annie was born in Germany. She was taken in by her mother's aunt after her parents died in a house fire in the days after she was born. Her aunt was married to a German diplomat assigned to the German UK embassy. At the time they met, Mike was already 25 and Annie was an 18-year-old blonde beauty. It was love at first sight, and about 8 months after they met, they were married in a small UK church. When Mike was transferred back stateside, a very pregnant Annie went with him to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. When their daughter Kristen was born, Mike was returning from Europe and did not get to the hospital for close to 5 hours later. At that time, Annie was sleeping when he first seen her. Now she was sleeping. Sherry's labor went into the 5th hour, and by this time, her parents had joined Richard and Richards were on the ground, but about 20 minutes out. By the time the nurse came to get Richard, his parents had been in the waiting room for several minutes. "Good luck, son," Mike said as Richard walked away. Mike was getting hungry as he had not had anything since breakfast and asked Annie if she wanted food. Annie said, "Right now all I want is some coffee." Mike asked Sherry's parents if they wanted anything. They said no. So, Mike walked away and ate some food out of a vending machine and bought a Diet Coke. Mike had only been back in the waiting room maybe 10 minutes when he noticed Richard standing in the hallway just inside the secured area with his hands on his knees. Worried, Mike got up and headed for the door. Just as Mike got close to the door, Richard looked up, took off the garment used and tossed it, then walked into the waiting room. He looked into the eyes of both sets of parents. He looked at Sherry's parents and said, "Sherry and her son are doing okay. When the nurses get them ready, you should be able to go see your daughter and grandson." "What is wrong, son?" Sherry's father asked Richard. "Mr. Sharp, mother and child are okay. The problem is the baby is not mine." Mike and Annie stood in shock for a minute, and Annie started crying. Sherry's mother looked at Richard and said, "Oh my God, Richard, are you sure?" Richard looked at the woman and said, "Yes, I am. The baby has jet black hair and has the facial features of a Mexican. Trust me, when you see your grandson, you will see what I am talking about." then turned to his parents and said, "Let's go. There is nothing left here for us." The three of them walked out of the waiting room. Annie was still crying, and Mike was getting angry. Mike was also proud of how his son acted. At a time when he was at his lowest, he kept his cool and showed Sherry's parents respect. Still, as he walked, he wanted to find that guy who impregnated Sherry and make him disappear. As the three of them walked through the hospital front lobby, Mike started to get sick. He ran to the men's room, thankfully close by, and on his knees emptied his stomach. When he came out, Annie handed him a wet paper towel and said, "Mike, are you okay, sweetheart?" Mike told her, "Annie, no, I am not okay. I am so sick right now, I am weak in my knees." Within minutes, Richard had grabbed his dad and helped them to his car. The rental car his folks had was okay in the parking lot. When they got to the hotel, Annie gave the desk clerk the information as well as a credit card, and they went to the room. The three of them sat for a while. Nobody was speaking until Mike spoke up and said, "Richard, you know your mother and I are here for you. You are not going through this alone. I also want you to think your coming actions through. Understand, son?" Richard looked first at his mom, then at his dad. "Dad, there is no way I can forget what Sherry did. I forgave her when I walked out of the delivery room, but I no longer trust her. Dad, would you please contact Mr. Jimmy and ask him to handle my divorce?" Jimmy was a very close, now semi-retired attorney. Jimmy was Mike's attorney and had been for almost 30 years. Mike looked at Richard and said, "Son, I will see if he can help you, but if he can't remember, his law firm has two offices, one in Greenville and another one in Myrtle Beach. I'm sure between those two offices they will have a family law attorney that can get the paperwork filed when you are ready." Annie looked at her men and said, "Son, I understand the loss of trust, but it breaks my heart knowing that small child, the real innocent, is the one who will suffer because of his mother's actions." Richard's voice broke as he said, "Mom, Sherry will one day see how her actions has destroyed her marriage and hurt more than just us." Just then Annie's phone rang. Annie looked at the caller ID and said, "That's Dawn calling. Who tells her about this?" Richard spoke up and said, "Tell her mom. I am not sure I can right now." Richard said. Mike had already walked into the bathroom when Annie answered the phone. Just before Dawn called her mother, she and her sister Kristen was sitting around her dining room table talking about their coming nephew. Kristen said, "Richard said they were planning to name him Michael Patrick after Mike and Mike's father Patrick." Dawn said, "I am going to call Mama to see what is going on." Then she got her phone and hit the contact that said mother. After several rings, Annie said, "Hello, sweetie. How is everything going? Has Michael Patrick made his appearance yet?" Dawn could hear her mother start sobbing, and the smile left her mouth. Kristen noticed the change and became concerned. "Dawn, sweetie, the baby is here, but Sherry gave birth to a half-Mexican baby. Is Kristen with you, sweetie?" Dawn started sobbing and handed the phone to her sister. Kristen ended the phone call, and both girls started hugging each other as both cried. Back at the hotel, Annie said, "Kristen and Dawn knows." Mike asked for Annie's phone and said, "I want to tell April." Annie handed the phone to her husband, and he called April and gave her the bad news. "That bitch, wait until I get my hands on her. Please tell Richard how much I love him, Daddy." Mike said, "Okay, I will. April, leave Sherry alone, understand me? Your mother and I are not happy about this, but I don't want your husband to be forced to bail you out of jail." "Okay, Daddy." Then April asked to speak to her mother. Mike handed the phone back to Annie. Back at the hospital, Sherry and her son had been assigned a room, and while upset, they admired the grandson. Sherry's mom sat beside Sherry and said, "Sherry, I can tell by the look on your face you feel bad. But honey, all of us will get past this." Sherry's father walked from where the baby laid over to her bed and bent down to kiss her. "Sherry, I am not at all happy about the circumstances of that child's birth, but the little guy is a part of our family, and I promise you now, he will never want for anything. Are you going to name him Michael still after all of this?" Sherry, in a light voice, just above a whisper, said, "Daddy, what I want more than anything is to have Richard and have him raise that baby." Sherry's father silently walked out of the room, leaving his wife and daughter to speak alone. He was really upset at Sherry's actions, but was also upset that Richard may not fight for his marriage. Then the man violently blew air out of his mouth and said, "I can't really blame him for being upset, though." The man also felt some hunger pangs hit him, so he decided to walk to see if the snack bar was still open. He found it open and ordered a burger and some fries. While he waited for his food, his phone rang, and it was his wife calling, wondering where he was. He told her in the snack bar eating, "Do you want anything to eat?" "No, just a cup of coffee would be nice. I am not hungry though." "Are you okay, Lenny?" The man replied, "I am okay, all things considered. I will be up in a few minutes." Sherry was asleep when her parents decided to go check into a hotel and get some rest. Back at the hotel where Richard and his parents were at earlier, Richard, with the help of a friend, had returned to the hospital, and Richard drove the rental car to the hotel and brought in their bags on a bag cart. His friend drove up in Richard's car. "Thanks for the help, Scott. We will split a six-pack later on." Scott gave Richard the thumbs-up sign and got into his car and left. Richard drove to his house and was expecting to see Sherry's parents there. He thought about it and figured they did not feel comfortable there tonight. So, he went in, opened a beer, then thought about it. A few minutes later, poured the beer down the drain. Alcohol is the last thing I need right now. Richard also got out his phone and called Major Heath Mills, his commanding officer, to tell him about the events of that day. The major told him to stay at home for a few days, but stay close to the base. Then Richard got into the shower, and as the water flowed all over his body, Richard started crying. After a while, Richard got out of the shower, brushed his teeth, and got into bed. By this time, it was almost midnight. Richard did not sleep well, but after a long time tossing and turning, he did finally fall into a fitful sleep. Mike was in bed holding a still sobbing Annie. Around 1 a.m., Mike got out of bed. Annie raised up and said, "Mike, I doubt either of us are going to get any sleep tonight." Mike looked at Annie and started putting some jeans and a t-shirt on. "Annie, I am going for a walk. See if you can get some sleep. When I return, I will be quiet." Annie nodded and laid back down. Mike walked outside and got into the rental car. Because Sherry was in a military hospital, Mike knew he could get Annie a sedative. Mike walked into the emergency room and was noticed by one of the nurses, who stood up and greeted him. "Hello, General. How may I help you?" Mike said, "Hello. If the physician on duty has a few minutes, I would like to speak to them." The nurse said, "Absolutely, General. I will be right back," then walked briskly out of the room. About 2 minutes later, a man in a white coat walked up to Mike and said, "General, my name is Dr. Bradley. What can I do for you tonight?" Mike said, "Let's go speak alone." After Mike told the young doctor what he wanted, the doctor looked at him and said, "General, I can't prescribe for your wife like this. It's unethical and illegal. However, sir, I can prescribe for you." Mike said, "Okay, Dr. Bradley, do it." The doctor told him, "Sir, I can have the prescription sent to here for you, but you are going to give the nurse your CAC so we can get into the system." Mike opened his wallet and handed the CAC to the nurse, who, using a keyboard reader, entered the doctor's order for alprazolam 1 mg PRN, then handed the CAC back to Mike. "Sir, the pharmacy generally takes about 15 to 30 minutes to get prescriptions back to us. If you like, I can get you some coffee while you wait." Mike looked at the nurse and said, "I need to go upstairs for a few minutes. I should not be longer than 30 minutes. When I return, I will pick up the prescription then." Mike walked out of the ER and entered the elevator. He then slowly walked to the OBGYN section. As he walked through the hallway, he saw through the small window in the door that Sherry was awake. He gently knocked on the door, and when Sherry looked up, she smiled and waved him in. As Mike entered, he stopped to look at the baby sleeping in the crib. Mike also noticed no name in the sliding name tag holder. He then walked to the bed and sat down. Sherry did not look good. Mike was sure he did not look well either. Mike knew the baby was not his grandson. Sherry started crying and said, "General, I am so sorry." Mike put up his finger and gently said, "Sherry, what's done is done. The important thing now is the future." Sherry said, "Richard hates me and my baby." Mike said, "No, Sherry, Richard does not hate you or the baby. Richard has already said he forgave you last night. The problem is he no longer trusts you. It is not my place to tell you this, but I am in hopes I can get you to come to an agreement with me. Richard is planning a divorce." As Mike said this, Sherry started to softly sob. "Sherry, Richard is leaving you. Here is my deal. If you give Richard an easy divorce, I will make sure you get to keep the better car he is driving. You can have the lion's share of what's in the bank. I will also help you get child support from the father. That man has a responsibility, and you need to hold his feet to the fire. Also, Sherry, you are not allowed to put my father's last name on that child's birth certificate. I highly suggest using your maiden name. If you use my last name, I will come after you legally." Sherry looked at the general and said, "Yes, sir, I was told I needed to name the child soon. I am going to use Mitchell Ryan Sharp. Thanks for the help. I will accept it. The child's father is the owner of a local business. Mike looked at Sherry and said, Sherry, until the divorce is final, you are still a member of this family. I am not going to throw you away. As you know, after the divorce is final, you will no longer be able to use the military health system. I will speak to Richard to make sure you are medically released before this happens. One last thing, Sherry. Going forward, if I can be of any help, please feel free to contact me. Then Mike turned to the baby. Take care of this little baby, Sherry. Then Mike walked over to the bed, bent over and kissed Sherry on her forehead and said, Goodbye, Sherry. I am positive Richard will speak to you soon. Then he walked out. Walking through the ER, the nurse gave him the prescription and he walked out of the hospital and returned to the hotel. He quietly entered the room only to find Annie sitting in a chair looking at him. Mike, I thought you was going for a walk. I see a prescription in your hand. Mike said, Annie, go get some water and take one of these. Annie looked at the prescription and knew by name what it was. She took the pill and so did Mike. The next morning, Mike and Annie awoke around 9 a.m. and both took a shower, and as Mike was shaving, Annie was speaking to her daughters in a group chat. April was still very angry and was not at all happy. Then Mike and Annie went to eat some breakfast. Mike dropped Annie off and waited until Richard opened the door, waved at him, and backed out of the driveway, then headed to the base. After arriving at the base, Mike drove to the headquarters of the fighter wing Richard was assigned to. Mike was in full uniform, and as he entered, everybody, both civilian and military, stood up. Mike did not answer any questions directed to him as he walked the same hallway he had walked many years ago when he was the wing commander here. Just as he was about to knock on the door, Colonel Paul Hood opened the door and stood aside as Mike entered the office and sat down. Colonel Hood, both of us know I am not in your chain of command either operationally or administratively. However, I am giving you a direct order. Understand me, Colonel? The colonel looked at him and said, Yes, sir. My son Richard is to be grounded until he gets cleared to fly by a flight surgeon. His wife had another man's baby last night, and I don't want him flying right now. The colonel picked up his phone and dialed a number, then waited for a moment. Captain Richard Rankin is grounded effective today. He is to schedule an appointment with a flight surgeon. He is not to fly for 2 weeks or until he sees the flight surgeon, whatever is the last to happen. Then he hung up. Mike stood up, thanked the colonel, and walked out of the building. At the time this happened, Sherry was being discharged. She rode in a wheelchair holding Mitch and was waiting with her mother for her father to pull up. Then they drove to her home. Richard was not there, but he did leave a short note. He said, Sherry, I am moving out. I am bunking with a friend. There are 2 months left on the lease, and my BH will pay the rent and utility bills until then. Please be out of this house in 2 months. This should be ample time to recover from childbirth. Make sure you have plenty of things you need. Sherry sat and looked at the note. Her mom was holding Mitch. Her father walked into the room and read the note. He looked at Sherry and said, Sherry, I am going to get some help and have you out of here in the coming weeks. Your mother will be staying here. I am leaving in the morning because I have to get back to the office. Then he walked out. Over the next 8 months, Richard and Sherry's divorce was finalized. Richard gave her his car. He also gave her almost all their savings. He promised her half of his final pay before the divorce was final. The day she took the car, the family was all together. April was the first one to see Sherry. Just as she started running toward her, Mike was able to get his arms around her waist and held her. Sherry's father was about to get between them, but stopped when he saw Mike grab her. Earlier that month, Mike had officially retired. He and Annie had returned to South Carolina to stay. Over the next several years, Richard was promoted to major and flew F-22s out of Langley Air Force Base. He had met and married a fiery redhead named Katie. As Katie was being carried to the labor room, Richard asked her, Katie, have you met any Mexicans over the last 9 months? Katie gave Richard the finger as she went back. Several hours later, an exhausted Katie gave birth to Michael Patrick Rankin. As soon as Mike saw his grandson, he knew he finally was present when a grandbaby was born. Sherry did go on to get child support from Mitch's dad. In fact, when Mitch was about 18 months old, she finally married that man.